I'm honored to be able to be here today and to contribute in any way to the exciting and important conversations you've been having over the last couple of days. I have to say that given what Eugene Robinson has identified for us, given what's at stake for the country, for the American dream, and for the millions of families facing income and financial insecurity, what you're doing is really critical. But it also is a little daunting, right? It's a big call to action. And we got curious in our work to understand in the scope and scale of the kinds of problems our constituencies are facing, what are social justice leaders doing to try and have an impact? And so that brought us to think about this idea of movement-oriented networks. And really, that came out of in-depth conversations with about a dozen leaders who have been consciously experimenting with these kinds of networks, as well as a series of about 7 dialogues we've had over the last year, involving funders, involving social justice leaders, academics, and thought leaders to understand if they're also seeing this phenomena around movement networks and how they may be differing or similar to prior attempts. So I offer this to you as a contribution to your thinking about how do you together move forward in making an impact on these critical issues. I'm neither as charming nor as tall as Eugene, so I'm going to rely on PowerPoint. Okay. So that is the wrong button. Thank you. There we go. So this is a quote from one of those leaders we talked to, Marco Davis, who's a veteran organizer and has worked within the Latino community and on immigrant rights and now is actually in the White House. He said that networks are not social movements, but social justice movements need networks, right? They're not the same, but they rely on them. But what is a movement network? Well, we cobbled together this definition from those conversations. They're multi-organizational, meaning they're bridging across organizational divides. They're movement-oriented, meaning that they're consciously and intentionally contributing to the larger social movement that they identify themselves as a part of. And in some cases, many social movements, right? That they're actually at the intersection of a variety of existing movements. They're focused on the long term. So not just short-term transactional relationships, but actually they're long-term and they're moving beyond any single issue campaign, right? They're looking much broader. And they're porous, so their boundaries are not as rigid as like a formal franchise structure. There are folks that come in and out, and there's center cores and there are people in the periphery, but the idea is that there's movement there. And their purpose is not to serve their members solely. Actually, what they're intending to do is meaningfully analyze, understand, and contribute to broader developments in their movements. What's a social movement? So, fortunately, there are academics who spend their lives understanding social movements and put together complex theories. I am not one of them, but I can crib from them. And with the help of Beth Zebsky and Dave Mann, this is a compiled definition of what is a social movement from that data. And they say that it's a collection of persons or groups who come together around a common concern, and that they're trying to create some societal change relative to that concern. So societal level being key here. And that they're, by definition, characterized by a variety of elements. One is that there's continual intentional action. They're working together over time collectively to create something, and they're doing it with intentionality. They have a perception of outsider status. So this is important because you don't actually have to have outsider status, but you have to perceive that you do, right? So you have to actually think that you cannot access the change you want through typical means to power. And you have to be broad. You got to have a lot of scope and scale. So what I say to folks is that while a bunch of people who meet in the mall and choreograph a very cool dance to a Lady Gaga song is coordinated and intentional, it is not at scope and scale, and it's not about societal change. That's not a movement, right? So we sometimes confuse social media flash mobs with movements, but they're not the same. And that there's a formation of a collective identity. So this is why everybody I know of who grew up in the 60s and 70s identifies with social movements, but not everybody I met who lived through the 60s and 70s actually attended a march, organized, was directly involved. They actually felt a part of it for taking small actions every day. It actually changed their identity, how they understood themselves. Okay? So if that's a movement, what on earth can a network do in the face of a big, organic, naturally growing movement? Well, these networks are playing some important roles, and not all networks play all these roles, but these movement networks we've been looking at play some of these roles, and they're vital. They build linkages and connections with a broader movement. So they actually bring groups together to connect with each other and actually identify and talk about what's the larger movement we're a part of, and how is that advancing over time. They deepen agreement on a shared political frame. They actually take the sub-issues each of the organizations may be working on, and they link it together in a political frame that has some cohesion, and actually says why your struggle is linked to my struggle, or maybe it's the same struggle. They coordinate efforts, take joint action, and disseminate information about what works. This is critical. You've got to be able to innovate tactically on the ground, and you have to be able to coordinate that action if you're going to have an impact in the face of your opposition. And they engage in advocacy campaigns. But what's different here is that these campaigns are not the ends, but they're a means to an ends. They're a way in which you actually demonstrate progress and create change for your constituencies, but how you run that campaign matters in your ability to stick together long-term over time. They marshal and increase resources and capacity. So they take what's there, but they also build on it and add to it. And resources here meaning people, organizations, money. And they cultivate new leaders that build that identity, that collective identity, as part of who they are. And they see themselves as part of that movement. Leadership cannot be static, and it cannot be too centralized. And you have to be able to identify and fill gaps in the movement's capacity to win, which requires being honest about those gaps. Doing all of this isn't easy. You've got to be able to juggle lots of complexity, whether that's the needs of different constituencies that are represented in your network, big organizations or small organizations, people coming in from different sectors, people trying to balance different approaches or political disagreements, and trying to balance the need for transparency with the need to move quickly, the need for lots of input, but being responsive to the political environment. To do this, we often try and build really rigid structures to try and hold all the things that are so hard about these networks. But what we've heard over and over again is that those structures can get in the way, and that they can actually, we can get attached to the structure as the glue that holds us together, forgetting that it's actually our values, our broader frame, our shared vision, and that we need to be creative and experimental in how we organize ourselves and the work we do together. But how do you do that? Well, we asked those leaders, that seems like a tall order. How do you foster that kind of flexibility? And these are some of the themes we heard. You analyze the movement and the political moment, and you continually do that. So the very kinds of conversations that Eugene Robinson's speech will spark in all of you, what you're writing on your cards on the table, that contributes, right? Accepting the network's real and potential power, right? The power it has to create the change you're committed to. Minimizing permanent structures, but not having no structure, right? So often there's a centralized, coordinated body that helps to provide some leadership, but always with lots of input and sort of communication with those throughout the network. And that often you don't try and get everybody in the network to agree to do something together. You actually pull subgroups of people where there's a critical mass and an important opportunity. And you learn to move opportunistically without losing sight of the long term. Those structures then have to live and die as the timing is right. You have to make space for marginalized and new voices. If your movements continually block out folks for whom their voices are important and relevant to your change, you'll wither over time and lose relevance. You need to learn from those outside your movement, whether that's from other sectors like the government sector, corporate sector, whether that's from other movements who are working on unrelated issues. And you need to be able to experiment and see innovation and take that on together, including a willingness to make mistakes, including a willingness to have things not work, and to learn from them. You got to encourage disagreement and disruption as part of that, create new time and space for reflection, and connect and align your actions with your vision. If your actions are disconnected from your vision, you won't stay together for very long. So those are some highlights that arose in our talk with other social justice leaders. And we hope that that's a useful contribution to your own thinking as you consider how to move from this place into the future and have an even greater impact. Thanks.